Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Unexpected Guest. Troy Kellerman stood at his kitchen window, watching his 9-year-old son Cooper kick a soccer ball around their backyard. The Saturday afternoon sun cast long shadows across their pristine lawn in the suburban neighborhood of Millbrook Heights. Troy had worked hard for this life. The 2-story colonial house, the manicured lawn, the white picket fence that seemed to promise the American dream. His security consulting business had flourished over the past 5 years, built on the foundation of discipline and tactical expertise he'd gained during his 8 years in Special Forces. The doorbell's chime interrupted his thoughts. Cooper's ball rolled to a stop as the boy looked toward the house with curious eyes. Troy dried his hands on a dish towel and headed to the front door, his military-trained instincts automatically cataloging the details of the stranger standing on his porch. The man was tall, roughly Troy's height at 6'2", with dirty blonde hair and weathered hands that spoke of manual labor. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt, and his smile seemed genuine enough, but something about his posture suggested a nervous energy barely contained beneath the surface. "Afternoon," the stranger said, extending his hand. "Name's Wade Hartley. Just moved into the house 3 doors down, the blue colonial. Thought I'd come by and introduce myself to the neighbors." Troy was about to respond when Cooper appeared in the doorway behind him. The boy took one look at Wade and froze, his face draining of color. Cooper had always been a social child, quick to warm up to new people, but now he pressed himself against Troy's leg with an urgency that immediately put Troy on alert. "Daddy," Cooper's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with an emotion Troy couldn't quite identify. "Tell him to leave." Troy frowned, glancing down at his son before looking back at Wade. "Cooper, that's not polite. Mr. Hartley is our new neighbor." But Cooper's reaction only intensified. His small hands clutched at Troy's jeans, and when Wade stepped closer with his hands still extended, the boy's eyes filled with tears. "Daddy, ask him where he lived before," Cooper said, his voice breaking with the kind of desperation that made Troy's protective instincts flare to life. Before Troy could process his son's strange behavior, footsteps echoed from the hallway behind them. Brenna emerged from their bedroom, probably drawn by the voices. She'd been taking one of her frequent afternoon naps, something that had become a pattern over the past year. Her auburn hair was disheveled, and she wore the silk robe Troy had bought her for their 10th anniversary. The moment Brenna saw Wade, she stopped dead in her tracks. The color drained from her face so completely that Troy thought she might faint. Her green eyes went wide with what looked like terror, and her hand flew to her throat in a gesture that seemed involuntary. "Brenna?" Troy's voice carried an edge of concern mixed with growing suspicion. "You okay, honey?" Wade's nervous smile faltered for just a moment as he looked between Brenna and Troy, but he quickly recovered. "Sorry, didn't mean to startle anyone. Like I said, just wanted to introduce myself. Wade Hartley." He gestured vaguely toward the street, the blue house with the black shutters. Brenna's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. Cooper pressed even closer to Troy, and the boy's obvious distress was beginning to trigger every alarm bell in Troy's mind. In his military days, he'd learned to trust his gut, and right now his gut was screaming that something was very, very wrong. "Where did you live before?" Troy asked, his tone casual, but his eyes locked on Wade's face. For the briefest moment, less than a second, Wade's expression shifted. It was so quick that most people would have missed it, but Troy had been trained to read micro-expressions, to catch the tiny tells that separated truth from deception. What he saw in that fleeting instant was panic, quickly masked by practiced ease. "Phoenix," Wade said smoothly. "Been there about 3 years. Before that, bounced around a lot with work. Construction and contracting, you know how it is." But Cooper shook his head violently. "No," the boy whispered, tears now streaming down his cheeks. "No, Daddy. He lived. Cooper, enough." Brenna's voice cracked like a whip, sharp and harsh in a way that made both Troy and Wade turn to look at her. She stepped forward, her face flushed now instead of pale, and placed a protective hand on Cooper's shoulder. "Go to your room. Now." The boy looked between his parents with confusion and fear, but Troy nodded toward the stairs. "Go ahead, buddy. We'll talk in a minute." Cooper reluctantly trudged upstairs, casting one last fearful glance at Wade before disappearing around the corner. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken tensions. Wade cleared his throat. "Kids, right? Sometimes they get confused about faces. Happens all the time." But his laugh sounded forced, and Troy noticed how his hands had formed loose fists at his sides. "Right," Troy said slowly, his analytical mind already working through the possibilities. His son's reaction, his wife's obvious recognition of this man, the way Wade's story didn't quite ring true. It all pointed to something that made Troy's jaw clench with barely controlled anger. Brenna had recovered some of her composure, but Troy could see the tremor in her hands as she smoothed down her robe. "Well, it was nice meeting you, Mr. Hartley," she said, her voice artificially bright. "I'm sure we'll see you around the neighborhood." It was clearly a dismissal, but Wade seemed reluctant to leave. His eyes lingered on Brenna for a moment too long, and Troy caught the brief, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a warning gesture that confirmed every suspicion now forming in his mind. "Absolutely," Wade said finally. "I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot of each other. Looking forward to being part of the community." He stepped back from the doorway but paused, looking directly at Brenna. "Maybe we'll run into each other at the grocery store or something. Catch up on old times." The phrase hung in the air like a threat, and Troy felt something cold and dangerous settle in his chest. This wasn't a chance encounter. This wasn't a coincidental move to their neighborhood. Wade Hartley had come here deliberately, and from the looks that had passed between him and Brenna, Troy was beginning to understand why. After Wade left, walking with deliberate casualness toward his car, Troy closed the door and turned to face his wife. Brenna was already backing toward the stairs, her face pale again and her eyes darting everywhere except toward Troy's face. "Brenna," Troy said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded a storm. "We need to talk." Chapter 2, Unraveling Truths. Troy watched his wife pace their bedroom like a caged animal, her hands shaking as she lit her third cigarette in 10 minutes. She'd quit smoking 2 years ago, or so she'd claimed, but the pack of Marlboros had appeared from the depths of her jewelry box with practiced ease. "His name is Wade Hartley," Troy said, settling into the chair by their window. His voice remained calm, controlled, the same tone he'd used during interrogations in Afghanistan. "He says he's from Phoenix. Says he's in construction." He paused, watching Brenna's reaction. "But you already knew all that, didn't you?" Brenna took a long drag and exhaled slowly, the smoke creating a barrier between them. "I don't know what you're talking about." Our son recognized him. A 9-year-old boy who's never been to Phoenix, who's barely been outside of Connecticut, somehow knows our new neighbor well enough to be terrified of him. Troy's hands remained relaxed in his lap, but his eyes never left her face. "So, I'll ask again, how do you know Wade Hartley?" The cigarette trembled between her fingers. "Maybe Cooper saw him around town before. Kids notice things." Troy had spent 13 years with Brenna, from her college days at UConn through courtship, marriage, and Cooper's birth. He knew every one of her tells. The way she touched her neck when nervous, how she couldn't maintain eye contact when lying, the slight Connecticut accent that crept into her voice when she was under pressure. "Try again," he said quietly. Brenna's composure finally cracked. She sank onto the edge of their bed, her head in her hands. "Troy, please, can't we just let this go? He's here now, but that doesn't mean anything has to change." The admission hit him like a physical blow, even though he'd been expecting it. Troy had built his business on his ability to read people, to anticipate their moves, to stay 3 steps ahead of any threat. But somehow his own wife had been playing a game he hadn't even known existed. "How long?" The question came out flat, emotionless. "It's over," Brenna said quickly. "Whatever you're thinking, it's over. It has been for months." "How long?" She looked up at him then, and he saw something in her eyes that he'd never seen before. Not just guilt, but defiance. As if part of her resented having to explain herself to him. 18 months, she whispered. Troy processed this information with the same methodical approach he used for tactical planning. 18 months ago, Brenna had started working late more often, started taking those afternoon naps, started suggesting that Cooper spend more weekends at her mother's house. All of it made sense now. Where did you meet him? Troy, please. Where? The gym. She took another drag, her hands steadier now. He was working on the renovation project at Fit First. We started talking. Fit First was Brenna's upscale gym downtown, the one where she spent 3 hours every Tuesday and Thursday. Troy had encouraged her membership, thinking the exercise was helping with her postpartum depression that had lingered long after Cooper's birth. He'd even been proud of how dedicated she'd become to her fitness routine. And Cooper knows him because Brenna's silence stretched for nearly a minute before she answered. Wade came to a few of Cooper's soccer games. I told Cooper he was a friend from work. The betrayal cut deeper than Troy had expected. Not just the affair, but the way she'd involved their son. Made Cooper complicit in her lies. Made the boy shake hands with his mother's lover and pretend everything was normal. Why did he move here? Troy asked. I don't know, but her voice lacked conviction. Troy stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. He walked to their bedroom window and looked out at the neighborhood he'd worked so hard to afford. The tree-lined streets, the well-maintained homes, the promise of security and stability he'd wanted to provide for his family. You're lying, he said without turning around. Wade Hartley didn't randomly choose Millbrook Heights. He didn't randomly choose a house 3 doors down from us. He came here for a reason. Behind him, he heard the bed creak as Brenna stood up. Troy, I swear to you, I had no idea he was moving here. When I ended things with him 6 months ago, I thought that was it. I thought he understood. Now Troy turned around, and Brenna took an involuntary step backward at whatever she saw in his expression. 6 months ago, but you said 18 months total. The affair lasted about a year, she said quickly. I ended it 6 months ago when I realized what I was doing to our family. To Cooper. To you. But he didn't want it to end. Brenna's cigarette had burned down to the filter without her noticing. She stubbed it out in the ashtray she'd hidden in her nightstand drawer, another small deception that added to the growing pile. He said he loved me, she whispered, so we belonged together. But I told him it was over. I chose my family. Troy's laugh was completely devoid of humor. You chose your family. After a year of fucking another man, you chose your family. He shook his head. How generous of you, Brenna. Troy, please. Does he know about Cooper's soccer schedule? About my business trips? About which nights I work late at the office? The color drained from her face again. What kind of question is that? The kind of question a man asks when he realizes his wife has been sharing details about their family with someone who might not have the best intentions. Troy's voice remained level, but there was something underneath now. Something cold and calculating that made Brenna wrap her arms around herself. Wade wouldn't hurt us, she said, but she didn't sound convinced. A man who starts an affair with a married woman, then moves 3 doors down from her family when she ends it? Troy moved closer, and Brenna instinctively backed toward the door. That's not the behavior of someone who's accepted rejection, Brenna. That's the behavior of someone who's escalating. Troy had seen enough obsessive behavior during his military service and his security consulting work to recognize the pattern. Wade Hartley hadn't moved to Millbrook Heights to start fresh. He'd moved here to continue something that Brenna thought she'd ended. I need you to pack a bag, Troy said suddenly. You and Cooper are going to stay at your mother's for a few days. What? What? Because I need time to think. And because until I figure out what Wade Hartley really wants, I don't want you or Cooper in this house. Brenna's defiance flared again. You can't just kick us out of our own home. Troy looked at her for a long moment. This woman he'd loved since they were 22 years old. The woman who'd promised to be faithful to him. The woman who'd built a double life so elaborate that she'd convinced their son to lie for her. Watch me, he said quietly. As Brenna stormed out to pack, Troy remained by the window, his mind already working through possibilities. Wade Hartley thought he was dealing with an unsuspecting husband who could be manipulated or intimidated. He thought he was playing a game where he held all the cards. But Troy Kellerman hadn't survived 8 years in special forces by being anyone's victim. And he hadn't built a successful security business by backing down from threats. Wade Hartley had just made the biggest mistake of his life. And Troy was going to make sure he paid for it. Chapter 3. The Hunter's Preparation. Troy stood in his basement office, surrounded by the tools of his trade. 3 monitors displayed different search results, police databases, and social media profiles. His military training had taught him that information was the most powerful weapon. And after 48 hours of digging, he was beginning to understand exactly what kind of man had decided to insert himself into the Kellerman family. Wade Hartley, age 34, had been born in Tucson, Arizona. High school dropout at 16. Military service, Army, dishonorably discharged after 2 years for assault charges that had been quietly buried. Since then, a string of construction jobs across the Southwest, never staying in one place for more than 18 months. 3 restraining orders from 3 different women in 3 different states. The pattern was clear. Wade was a predator who specialized in married women. He would insert himself into their lives, usually through work or social connections, then gradually isolate them from their support systems. When the women tried to end the relationships, Wade would escalate, following them, harassing them, sometimes moving to be closer to them. But Brenna had been different. She'd had something the others hadn't, a husband with the skills to fight back. Troy's phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "Cooper's asking when we can come home. What should I tell him?" Troy typed back, "Tell him Daddy's working on a surprise for the family. Be patient." It wasn't entirely a lie. Troy was working on something for the family. He was working on eliminating the threat that had taken up residence 3 doors down. The doorbell rang upstairs, and Troy checked his security monitors. Wade Hartley stood on his front porch, holding a bottle of wine and wearing what he probably thought was a friendly smile. Troy almost admired the man's audacity. Troy climbed the stairs and opened the door, making sure to appear slightly disheveled and emotionally drained. Exactly what Wade would expect from a man whose wife had just left him. "Wade," Troy said, injecting just the right note of weary resignation into his voice. "What can I do for you?" Wade held up the wine bottle. "Thought you might need some company. Saw Brenna and Cooper leaving with suitcases yesterday. Figured you might be going through a rough patch." The pretense of neighborly concern was almost insulting, but Troy played along. "Yeah, we're having some problems. She took Cooper to her mother's for a few days while we figure things out." Wade's eyes lit up with poorly concealed satisfaction. "Sorry to hear that, man. Marriage is tough. Mind if I come in? Maybe we can talk about it." Troy stepped aside, gesturing Wade into his living room. This was perfect. Wade was making it easy by coming to him. "Can I get you something to drink?" "Beer." "Beer sound great." Troy retrieved 2 bottles from the kitchen, making sure to keep Wade in sight through the pass-through window. When he returned, Wade was studying the family photos on the mantelpiece, particularly the ones of Brenna. "Beautiful woman," Wade said, accepting his beer. "Beautiful family. You're a lucky man." "I thought so." Troy settled into his recliner, keeping his body language open and non-threatening. But apparently luck runs out. Wade sat on the couch, directly across from Troy. He was trying to appear casual, but Troy noticed how his eyes kept scanning the room, cataloging exits and potential weapons. Military training, even abbreviated training, left marks. "You want to talk about what happened?" Wade asked. Sometimes it helps to get a man's perspective. Troy almost smiled at the irony. "She's been having an affair. Found out a couple days ago." He took a long pull of his beer, watching Wade's reaction over the rim of the bottle. Wade's expression was a masterclass in false sympathy. "Damn, that's rough. How'd you find out?" "Phone records. Credit card statements. You know how it is. Once you start looking, the evidence is everywhere." Troy shook his head. 18 months. A whole year and a half of my life was a lie. "Did she say who it was?" Now, Troy did smile, but it was the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Some guy from her gym. Said his name was Wade." The beer bottle froze halfway to Wade's lips. For just a moment, his mask slipped completely, and Troy saw the real man underneath. Calculating, dangerous, and now uncertain about how much Troy actually knew. "Common name," Wade said carefully. Very common. Made it hard to track him down at first. Troy leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conversational tone. But I'm pretty good at finding people. It's what I do for a living. Wade set his beer down on the coffee table, and Troy noticed the slight tremor in his hands. What kind of work do you do? Security consulting, risk assessment, background investigations. Troy's smile widened. I help people identify threats before they become problems. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long. Wade was clearly trying to decide whether Troy was playing games or genuinely didn't know who he was talking to. Troy let him wonder. So what are you going to do? Wade asked finally. About my marriage? Or about the man who destroyed it? Your marriage. Troy stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Wade's house. Well, that depends on what this Wade character does next. See, Brenna says the affair is over. Says she chose her family. But I'm wondering if old Wade got the message. Behind him, Troy heard Wade shift on the couch. What do you mean? Troy turned around, and this time he let Wade see exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. The friendly neighbor facade was gone, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. I mean that if some piece of shit thinks he can walk into my life, fuck my wife, corrupt my son, and then stick around to see what else he can take from me. Troy's voice remained calm, almost conversational. Well, that would be a very serious miscalculation on his part. Wade stood up slowly, his hand moving toward his jacket pocket before he caught himself. Troy, I think maybe I should go. You know what's interesting about background investigations? Troy continued, as if Wade hadn't spoken. The things you can learn about a person with just a little bit of effort. Employment history, criminal records, patterns of behavior. Wade's face had gone pale. What are you saying? I'm saying that any man who would move 3 doors down from a woman who's rejected him, that's not normal behavior, Wade. That's predatory behavior. And in my experience, predators don't stop escalating until someone makes them stop. Wade backed toward the door, but Troy didn't move to block his path. He didn't need to. The message had been delivered. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Wade said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. No misunderstanding at all, Troy replied. You moved here because you thought you were dealing with some suburban dad who wouldn't fight back. You thought you could intimidate me into giving up my family. Troy's smile was cold as winter. But here's what you didn't count on, Wade. I'm not some civilian who's going to roll over for you. Wade reached the door and fumbled with the handle. I'm just your neighbor, man. I don't know what you think. Wade, Troy's voice cut through the other man's protests like a blade. Pack your shit and leave town. Tonight. Because if you're still in that house tomorrow morning, I'm going to start treating you like the threat you actually are. Wade fled without another word, practically running across the yard to his house. Troy watched through the window as lights came on throughout Wade's house, seeing the man's silhouette moving frantically from room to room. Troy pulled out his phone and called his old Army buddy, Derek Rodriguez, who now ran a private security firm in Hartford. Derek, it's Troy. I need a favor. How quickly can you get a surveillance team on a house in Millbrook Heights? Full coverage, 24/7. What kind of trouble are you in, brother? Troy watched Wade, loading boxes into his truck under the cover of darkness. The kind that requires professional attention. And Derek? Make sure your guys are armed. Because Troy had been serious about his threat. If Wade Hartley was still there in the morning, Troy was going to stop treating this like a domestic dispute and start treating it like a war. And in war, Troy Kellerman had never lost. Chapter 4. The trap is set. Wade Hartley was still there in the morning. Troy watched from his kitchen window as Wade loaded landscaping equipment from his truck, making a show of beginning work on his front yard. The message was clear. Wade wasn't intimidated. He wasn't leaving. If anything, he was doubling down on his presence in the neighborhood. Derek's surveillance team had confirmed Troy's suspicions throughout the night. Wade had loaded boxes into his truck around midnight, but had never left the property. Instead, he'd unloaded everything before dawn and had spent the early morning hours making obvious preparations to stay. It was a calculated move designed to show Troy that threats wouldn't work. Wade Hartley had just made his second major mistake. Troy's phone rang, and Derek's voice crackled through the speaker. Your boys got company. Black sedan, 2 occupants, been parked at the end of the street for the past hour. They're watching his house. Can you give me plates? Already ran them. Rental car, paid for with a credit card belonging to Marcus Vega. Troy's blood ran cold. Marcus Vega was a name from Wade's military file, another dishonorably discharged soldier who'd served time for assault and intimidation. If Wade was calling in backup, the situation had just escalated beyond a simple stalking case. "How many men can you get me?" Troy asked. "For what kind of operation?" Troy considered his words carefully. Derek was a good friend, but he was also a legitimate businessman who couldn't afford to be associated with anything that crossed certain lines. The kind where everyone goes home safe, but the problem gets permanently resolved. Derek was quiet for a long moment. "Troy, you know I can't." "Then just maintain surveillance and stay ready to call the cops if things go sideways." Troy ended the call and immediately dialed another number. "Vinny? It's Troy Kellerman. I need to call in that favor." Vincent Torino was not a friend in any conventional sense. He was a former Special Forces operator who'd gone into business for himself after discharge, providing services that legitimate security companies couldn't offer. Troy had helped Vinny out of a jam with some drug dealers in Hartford 2 years ago, and Vinny had promised that the debt would be repaid when needed. "Troy, my friend, what can I do for you? I need someone to disappear. Permanently. But it has to look accidental." Vinny chuckled. "How permanently?" "Enough to send a message to anyone else who might be thinking about threatening my family." "This about the guy who's been fucking your wife?" Troy should have been surprised that Vinny already knew, but information was currency in Vinny's world. Him and whoever he's brought with him. 2 for 1. That's gonna cost extra. Money's not an issue. It never is with you, brother. Give me 12 hours to set it up. And Troy, maybe take your family somewhere nice for the weekend. Somewhere with good alibis. After ending the call, Troy walked upstairs to his home office and began making arrangements. Brenna and Cooper would need to stay at her mother's for at least another week, maybe longer. His business had a legitimate consulting contract in Boston that would provide perfect cover for his absence when everything went down. But first, he needed to accelerate Wade's timeline. Troy dressed in his running gear and headed outside for his usual morning jog. As he stretched on his front lawn, he made sure to wave at Wade, who was installing a new mailbox with deliberate, exaggerated care. "Beautiful morning," Troy called out cheerfully. Wade looked up, clearly confused by Troy's sudden change in demeanor. "Yeah, it is." Troy jogged over, maintaining his friendly neighbor facade. "Listen, I wanted to apologize for last night. I was pretty drunk, and I think I might have said some things that didn't make much sense." Wade straightened up, his hand moving instinctively toward the hammer at his belt. "Don't worry about it, man. We all have rough nights. The thing is, Brenna told me she might know you from somewhere. Said she recognized your name, but couldn't place it." Troy stretched his hamstring, the picture of casual conversation. "You ever go to Fit First downtown? The gym on Harbor Street?" Wade's eyes narrowed. "Can't say I have." "Weird. She was sure she'd seen you there." Troy shrugged. "Oh well, probably just one of those faces. Anyway, I should get going. Got a big meeting in Boston this afternoon." Troy jogged away before Wade could respond, but he could feel the man's eyes burning into his back. The seed was planted. Wade now knew that Troy would be out of town, and he also knew that Brenna had been talking about him. Both pieces of information would drive Wade to make his next move faster than he'd originally planned. 3 blocks away, Troy stopped and called Vinny back. "Change of plans. Make it look like a breaking gone wrong. Tonight." "Tonight? That's awfully fast, even for me. The target just learned that I'll be out of town. He's going to move on my wife and son, probably within the next few hours. I need him taken care of before that happens." "What about the backup in the sedan?" Troy's smile was cold. "What about them? I like the way you think, brother. But that's definitely going to cost extra. Bill me." The rest of the morning passed in careful choreography. Troy made sure to be seen loading his overnight bag into his car, checking his watch, and generally appearing to be in a hurry to leave for his fabricated Boston meeting. Derek's surveillance team confirmed that Wade was watching from his front window, and the men in the sedan had positioned themselves with clear sight lines to both Troy's house and Wade's. At noon, Troy drove away with great fanfare, making sure to wave goodbye to Wade as he passed. But instead of heading toward the interstate, he drove to a storage facility on the other side of town, where he'd rented a unit under a false name 6 months earlier. Inside the unit was everything he'd need for the next 24 hours. camping gear, freeze-dried food, water, and most importantly, a complete change of clothes and documentation that would place him in Boston should anyone ask questions later. Troy settled in to wait. By his calculations, Wade would make his move sometime after dark. He'd probably try to break into Troy's house first, looking for information about Brenna's whereabouts or evidence of how much Troy actually knew about the affair. When he didn't find what he was looking for, he'd head to Brenna's mother's house. But Wade would never make it that far. Vinny's people were already in position. By tomorrow morning, Wade Hartley and his friend Marcus Vega would be nothing but a memory and a police report about a home invasion gone wrong. Troy's phone buzzed with a text from Brenna. "Cooper wants to know when you're coming to see him. He misses you." Troy stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Tell him Daddy's taking care of the bad man. We'll all be together soon." It wasn't a lie. By tomorrow, the threat to his family would be eliminated, and they could begin the process of rebuilding their lives. But first, Troy was going to make sure that Wade Hartley learned what happened when someone threatened what belonged to Troy Kellerman. The lesson would be permanent. Chapter 5, Blood and Consequences. The call came at 3:47 a.m. Troy jerked awake in his storage unit, instantly alert despite having dozed fitfully for only 2 hours. Vinny's voice was tight with controlled urgency. "We have a problem." Troy was already pulling on his boots. "What happened?" "Your boy Wade made his move around midnight, just like you predicted. But when my guys got to his house, they found something else entirely." "What kind of something else?" "The kind that involves federal fucking agents." Troy's blood turned to ice. "Say that again." "DEA had the place under surveillance. Turns out your wife's boyfriend wasn't just some stalker ex. He was running drugs through his construction business, using renovation contracts as cover for moving product. The feds have been watching him for months." Troy closed his eyes, his tactical mind immediately calculating the implications. If Wade was under federal surveillance, then every move Troy had made over the past 3 days was potentially on record. His conversations with Derek, his visit to Vinny, his staged departure for Boston, all of it could be evidence in a federal investigation. "Are your people clear?" "For now. We pulled back when we saw the surveillance van." "But Troy, there's more. Wade and his friend didn't just disappear into the night. They grabbed someone on their way out." "Who?" "Mrs. Chun from the house between yours and Wade's. Elderly Asian woman, lives alone. Looks like they needed a hostage for whatever they're planning next." Troy's jaw clenched. Helen Chun was a 73-year-old widow who brought Cooper cookies every Christmas and kept an eye on the house when Troy and Brenna went out of town. If Wade had escalated to kidnapping innocent neighbors, the situation had spiraled far beyond anything Troy had prepared for. "Where are they now?" "Unknown. But Troy, you need to get back here." The DEA found something else in Wade's house. Photos of your wife, your son, detailed surveillance notes about your family's routine. This guy wasn't just obsessed with Brenna. He was planning something big. Troy was already breaking down his temporary camp, his movements efficient and automatic. "I'm 20 minutes out. And Troy, come armed. Whatever Wade's planning, I don't think he's finished with your family." The drive back to Millbrook Heights passed in a blur of tactical planning and cold fury. Troy had dealt with hostage situations during his military service, but never when his own family was at the center of the threat matrix. Wade had crossed every line by involving Mrs. Chun, and now Troy was going to cross a few lines of his own. The neighborhood was a chaos of flashing lights when Troy arrived. DEA vehicles, local police cruisers, and ambulances lined the street. Derek intercepted him before he could reach his house. "Where the hell have you been?" Derek demanded. "The feds have been looking for you for 3 hours. Boston. I had a consulting meeting." Troy's story was rehearsed and backed by documentation, but he could see skepticism in Derek's eyes. "What's the situation?" "Wade's gone completely off the rails. After he grabbed Mrs. Chun, he called 911 and told them he had explosive devices planted in 3 houses on this street. Yours, his, and the Chun house. Bomb squad's been clearing the area while they search." Troy scanned the controlled chaos around them, his trained eye picking out the federal agents from the local cops. One man in particular caught his attention, a tall, lean agent with prematurely gray hair who was clearly running the operation. "That's Special Agent Morrison," Derek said, following Troy's gaze. He's been asking a lot of questions about your business, your military background, and your relationship with Wade. My relationship with Wade? I met the man 3 days ago. That's what I told him. But he seems to think there's more to the story. Before Troy could respond, Agent Morrison approached them. His expression was carefully neutral, but Troy recognized the look of a federal investigator who smelled something rotten. Mr. Kellerman? I'm Special Agent Morrison, DEA. I need to ask you some questions about Wade Hartley. Troy extended his hand. Of course, though I'm not sure how much help I can be. I barely knew the man. Morrison didn't shake his hand. Where were you tonight between midnight and 4 a.m.? Boston, the Marriott downtown. I can provide receipts if needed. We'll need to verify that. In the meantime, can you tell me about your conversation with Mr. Hartley yesterday morning? Troy's expression didn't change, but his mind was racing. If the DEA had audio surveillance on Wade's house, they might have recorded parts of their conversation. He needed to be very careful about how much he revealed. He came by with a bottle of wine. Said he wanted to be neighborly. We talked for maybe 20 minutes. What did you talk about? General stuff. The neighborhood. My family. He asked about my work. Morrison pulled out a small recorder. Mr. Kellerman, I'm going to play something for you. This is from a surveillance device we had placed in Mr. Hartley's residence. Wade's voice crackled through the speaker, distorted but audible. The husband knows. Kellerman figured out about me and Brenna. He's some kind of military contractor or something. Made threats about treating me like a threat. Morrison stopped the recording and looked at Troy. That doesn't sound like a neighborly conversation about the weather. Troy met his gaze steadily. Wade Hartley was having an affair with my wife. I confronted him about it and told him to stay away from my family. If that constitutes a threat in your book, Agent Morrison, then I'd suggest you haven't spent much time around men whose wives have been unfaithful. Did you threaten to kill him? I told him to leave town. When someone is stalking your family, Agent Morrison, you make it clear that their behavior won't be tolerated. Morrison studied Troy for a long moment. Mr. Kellerman, Wade Hartley has been under federal surveillance for the past 4 months as part of a drug trafficking investigation. During that time, we've documented increasingly erratic behavior focused on your wife and son. Photos, surveillance notes, purchases of weapons and surveillance equipment. Yesterday's conversation with you appears to have triggered a complete psychological break. Troy felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of break? The kind where he's barricaded himself and an elderly hostage in an abandoned warehouse on the east side, claiming to have enough explosives to level a city block. Morrison's voice was grim. He's demanding to speak with your wife. Says he wants to explain why he had to take drastic measures to protect her from you. The pieces of Wade's deranged plan finally clicked into place. In his twisted mind, Troy had become the villain, the abusive husband keeping Wade from his true love. Taking Mrs. Chun wasn't just a desperate move. It was Wade's attempt to force a confrontation that would end with Brenna choosing between her husband and an innocent woman's life. Where's my wife now? Safe. We've got her and your son in protective custody until this is resolved. Troy looked around at the organized chaos of the federal response. Bomb squads, SWAT teams, negotiators. All of it focused on containing a situation that had spiraled far beyond anyone's control. Agent Morrison, Troy said carefully, I think you should know that Wade Hartley isn't just having a psychological break. Based on what I observed yesterday, he's been planning this escalation for weeks, maybe months. The move to this neighborhood, the timing of everything, it's all been leading to this moment. Morrison's eyes narrowed. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that your standard hostage negotiation protocols aren't going to work here. Wade doesn't want money or safe passage. He wants my wife to validate his delusion that I'm the problem and he's the solution. And Troy met Morrison's gaze with the steady confidence of a man who'd faced impossible odds before. And I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to give him what he wants. Chapter 6. Into the Abyss. The abandoned Hartwell manufacturing warehouse squatted on the east side like a cancer, its broken windows and rust-stained walls testament to the industrial decline that had claimed this part of the city. Troy studied the building through binoculars from the DEA command post, noting the tactical challenges it presented. Multiple entry points, high ceiling that would complicate any assault, and too many places for Wade to hide with his hostage. Absolutely not, Agent Morrison said when Troy finished outlining his plan. You're a civilian, Mr. Kellerman. This is a federal operation. Troy lowered the binoculars and turned to face the federal agent. Agent Morrison, I spent 8 years in special forces conducting exactly these kinds of operations. I know building assault tactics better than most of your SWAT team. And more importantly, I'm the only person Wade Hartley wants to talk to. Wade wants to talk to your wife, not you. Wade wants to prove that he's the better man, that he can protect Brenna from the terrible husband who threatens innocent neighbors. Troy's voice was cold with calculation. He's not going to hurt Mrs. Chun as long as he thinks there's a chance to win this confrontation. But if your negotiators keep stalling, if he starts to realize that Brenna isn't coming, he's going to start making good on his threats about those explosives. Morrison consulted with his team leader, a conversation Troy couldn't hear but could read in their body language. The federal agents were out of options, and everyone knew it. Wade had been clear in his demands. Bring Brenna Kellerman to the warehouse, alone, or he would detonate the devices he claimed to have rigged throughout the building. Even if I agreed to this insane plan, Morrison said finally, what makes you think you can succeed where trained negotiators have failed? Troy picked up the tactical vest Derek had brought him from his storage unit. Because Wade Hartley thinks he's the hero of this story, Agent Morrison. He thinks he's rescuing a woman from an abusive husband and protecting her from a man who makes threats against innocent neighbors. Troy strapped on the vest with practiced efficiency. But when I walk into that warehouse, he's going to realize he's not the hero. He's not even the victim. He's just another predator who picked the wrong family to fuck with. The plan was simple, which made it both elegant and dangerous. Troy would approach the warehouse openly, wearing civilian clothes over his tactical vest. He would be wired for sound, but otherwise unarmed, at least visibly. Wade would see him coming and would make the natural assumption that Brenna had sent her husband instead of coming herself. What Wade wouldn't see was Derek's team positioned around the building's perimeter, or the federal agents ready to move on Troy's signal. He also wouldn't see the ceramic knife strapped to Troy's ankle, or the flashbang grenades disguised as cell phones in his jacket pockets. Remember, Morrison said as Troy prepared to leave the command post, we need Wade alive. He's got information about a drug network that spans 3 states. Troy's smile was sharp as a blade. I'll do my best. The walk to the warehouse felt like every patrol Troy had ever taken in hostile territory, hyper-aware of every shadow, every potential shooting position, every escape route. The building loomed larger as he approached, its broken windows like dead eyes watching his advance. Troy's earpiece crackled with Morrison's voice. Thermal imaging shows 2 heat signatures on the 2nd floor, northwest corner. Wade's got Mrs. Chun in what looks like an office space. Troy clicked his radio twice to acknowledge and pushed through the warehouse's main entrance. The interior was a cavern of shadows and rust, broken machinery scattered across a concrete floor that echoed with every footstep. Graffiti covered the walls, and the smell of decay and neglect permeated everything. Wait, Troy called out, his voice carrying through the empty space. It's Troy Kellerman. Brenna sent me. Silence for nearly 30 seconds. Then Wade's voice drifted down from somewhere above. Where is she? I told them I wanted to talk to Brenna. She's scared, Wade. Scared of what this has become. Troy moved deeper into the warehouse, following a set of metal stairs toward the 2nd floor. She asked me to come instead, to hear what you have to say. She should be here herself. Wade's voice cracked with emotion and frustration. She needs to understand what you've done to us. Troy reached the 2nd floor landing and could see light spilling from a doorway at the far end of a corridor lined with abandoned offices. What I've done. Wade, I think we need to talk about what you've done. I protected her. I gave her what she needed when her own husband was too busy playing soldier to notice she was dying inside. Troy moved slowly down the corridor, his every sense alert for signs of explosives or booby traps. Through his earpiece, he could hear Morrison coordinating with the SWAT team, preparing for multiple entry points once Troy gave the signal. Is that what you told yourself? Troy called out. That you were protecting her? I loved her. The desperation in Wade's voice was unmistakable now. I love her. More than you ever could. Troy reached the doorway and could see into the office space. Wade stood near a broken window, his arm around Mrs. Chen's frail shoulders. The elderly woman was trembling, but appeared unharmed. Wade held a pistol in his free hand, but it was pointed toward the floor rather than at his hostage. More importantly, Troy could see the explosive devices Wade had rigged around the room. Crude but potentially effective pipe bombs connected by visible wiring to a dead man's switch in Wade's left hand. "Hello, Wade," Troy said, stepping into the doorway with his hands raised. "Mrs. Chen, are you all right?" The elderly woman nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm okay, Troy, but he says he's going to hurt people if Brenna doesn't come." "Brenna's not coming," Troy said, his eyes locked on Wade's face. "But I'm here, and I think it's time you and I had an honest conversation about what this is really about." Wade's grip tightened on both the pistol and the dead man's switch. "This is about love, Troy. Something you obviously don't understand." "Love." Troy stepped further into the room, calculating angles and distances. "Wade, let me tell you what I see. I see a man who stalked a married woman for 18 months. A man who manipulated her into an affair while she was dealing with postpartum depression. A man who involved her 9-year-old son in his deception. A man who moved 3 doors down from her family when she tried to end things." Troy's voice hardened. "That's not love, Wade. That's obsession. That's predatory behavior. You don't know anything." Wade's face flushed with anger. "You were never there for her. Always working, always traveling, always putting your business ahead of your family." "You're right," Troy said, and Wade blinked in surprise. "I wasn't there enough. I was building a business, trying to provide for my family, and I missed the signs that my wife was struggling. That's on me." Troy took another step closer. "But here's the difference between you and me, Wade. When I realized I'd failed my family, I tried to fix it. When you realized Brenna didn't want you anymore, you decided to take her by force." Wade's hand was shaking now, both from emotion and from the weight of the dead man's switch. "She does want me. She just doesn't understand that you're the problem." "Then why isn't she here, Wade?" Troy's voice was almost gentle now. "If she really wanted you, if she really believed I was the problem, why did she choose to stay with me instead of running away with you 6 months ago?" The question hit Wade like a physical blow. His face crumpled with the realization that his entire delusion was built on a foundation of wishful thinking and self-deception. "Because you threatened her," Wade whispered. "Because you made her afraid of what you'd do." Troy shook his head sadly. "No, Wade. Because she realized that what happened between you two wasn't love. It was a mistake. A moment of weakness that she regretted the moment it started getting serious." "You're lying. Ask Mrs. Chun," Troy said, nodding toward the elderly woman. "She sees everything that happens in our neighborhood. She's watched my family for years. Ask her if she's ever seen me raise my voice to my wife. Ask her if she's ever seen any signs that Brenna was afraid of me." Mrs. Chun looked between Troy and Wade, understanding what Troy was trying to do. "Brenna was never afraid of Troy," she said softly. "She was afraid of you. She told me you wouldn't leave her alone after she ended things." Wade's carefully constructed reality was crashing down around him, and Troy could see the exact moment when the man's last shred of self-control snapped. "No!" Wade screamed, raising the pistol toward Troy. But Troy had been ready for this moment since entering the warehouse. As Wade's hand came up, Troy was already moving, diving toward the window while simultaneously triggering the flashbang grenade in his jacket pocket. The explosion of light and sound disoriented everyone in the room, but Troy's military training had prepared him for the sensory overload. He rolled to his feet, drew the ceramic knife from his ankle, and was on Wade before the man could recover from the flashbang's effects. The knife went in just below Wade's ribs, angled upward toward his heart. Wade's eyes went wide with shock and pain, the pistol falling from nerveless fingers as he collapsed. "That's for threatening my family," Troy whispered in Wade's ear as the man's life ebbed away. Troy quickly checked Mrs. Chun, shaken but unharmed, and then carefully examined the dead man's switch. It was a simple pressure device that would detonate the explosives if released. Troy held it steady while calling for the bomb squad through his radio. "Target is down," he reported to Morrison. "Hostage is safe, but we still have active explosives in here." As federal agents flooded into the warehouse, Troy remained calm and professional, following all protocols for evidence preservation and hostage safety. To any observer, it looked like a textbook resolution to a hostage situation, a civilian who'd gotten lucky during a desperate struggle with an unstable kidnapper. Only Troy knew that there had been nothing lucky about it. Wade Hartley had finally learned what happened when someone threatened what belonged to Troy Kellerman. The lesson had been permanent. Chapter 7. Reckoning. 3 days after the warehouse incident, Troy sat in a sterile federal interview room, facing Agent Morrison across a metal table. The room was windowless and gray, designed to make suspects uncomfortable, but Troy had been in far worse places during his military service. He sipped black coffee from a foam cup and waited for Morrison to begin what he knew would be a carefully orchestrated interrogation. The knife wound was very precise, Morrison said, opening a thick file folder. One thrust, angled upward between the ribs, piercing the heart. That's the kind of wound you see from someone with combat training. Troy met Morrison's gaze steadily. Wade Hartley was pointing a gun at me and threatening to detonate explosives that could have killed Mrs. Chun and half your federal agents. I did what I had to do to protect innocent lives. Except the ME's report shows that Wade was stabbed from behind, not during a frontal struggle. The flashbang disoriented everyone in that room, Agent Morrison. I'm not sure anyone could reconstruct the exact sequence of events with complete accuracy. Morrison pulled out a photograph, a crime scene shot showing Wade's body positioned near the window. Wade's blood spatter pattern suggests he was facing away from you when a knife went in. That's not consistent with your statement about a struggle for the gun. Troy leaned back in his chair, his expression calm. Are you suggesting that I murdered Wade Hartley in cold blood, Agent Morrison? Because if that's your theory, I'd like to know what evidence you have beyond blood spatter analysis that could have multiple interpretations. Morrison stared at him for a long moment before pulling out another folder. Let's talk about Vincent Torino. Troy's expression didn't change, but he felt a familiar chill. Vinny was supposed to have stayed completely off the radar during this operation. Vincent Torino is a convicted felon who runs a questionable security company out of Hartford. Morrison continued. Phone records show that you called his number twice in the 24 hours before Wade's death. What did you discuss? Vincent Torino occasionally provides subcontractor services for my legitimate security consulting business. I called him about a potential job in Boston. A job that never materialized. Not all business inquiries result in contracts, Agent Morrison. Morrison opened the second folder and spread several surveillance photos across the table. The images showed Troy at the storage facility, Vinny's men conducting reconnaissance around Wade's house, and other activities that painted a picture of coordinated planning. We've been watching Vincent Torino for months as part of a separate investigation, Morrison said. Imagine our surprise when you appeared in our surveillance photos. Troy studied the images with professional interest. The surveillance had been comprehensive, but not perfect. There were gaps that a good defense attorney could exploit, and the photos themselves were circumstantial at best. Agent Morrison, are you charging me with a crime? Because if not, I think this conversation is over. Morrison gathered up the photos and files. Walk me through it, Mr. Kellerman. The real version. Troy considered his options. Morrison was clearly fishing, trying to get him to volunteer information that the federal investigation hadn't been able to prove conclusively. The smart play was to remain silent and demand a lawyer. But Troy had been thinking about something Mrs. Chun had said in the warehouse. She told me you wouldn't leave her alone after she ended things. The elderly woman had been talking about Brenna's fears regarding Wade, but the words applied equally to Morrison's investigation. Sometimes the only way to end a threat was to meet it head on. You want the real version? Troy asked. Here it is. Wade Hartley was a predator who targeted my wife when she was vulnerable. He manipulated her into an affair, involved my son in his deception, and then escalated to stalking and kidnapping when she tried to end things. Your federal investigation gave him cover to continue his obsessive behavior because you needed him operational for your drug case. Morrison's eyes narrowed. We had no idea about his fixation on your family until... Bullshit. Troy's voice cut through Morrison's protest like a blade. You had surveillance on Wade for months. You knew about the affair. You knew about his escalating behavior. You knew he was taking photos of my wife and son and planning something that was way outside the scope of your drug investigation. But you let it continue because Wade was useful to you. The accusation hung in the air between them, and Troy could see from Morrison's expression that he'd hit close to the mark. So yes, Troy continued, when I realized that federal law enforcement wasn't going to protect my family from your confidential informant, I made other arrangements. I called Vincent Torino because I needed professional advice about how to handle a threat that was escalating beyond civilian capabilities. And when Wade took an innocent elderly woman hostage and started making threats about explosives, I eliminated that threat using the skills the United States Army taught me. Morrison sat back in his chair. You're admitting to premeditated murder. I'm admitting to protecting my family from a dangerous predator that your investigation enabled and protected. Troy stood up slowly. And unless you're prepared to charge me with a crime, Agent Morrison, this conversation is over. Troy walked toward the door, but Morrison's voice stopped him. Your wife knows. Troy turned around slowly. Knows what? Brenna knows that Wade's death wasn't self-defense during a struggle. She's seen the crime scene photos, read the ME's report. She knows you killed him deliberately. Morrison's smile was cold. She also knows about your phone calls to Vincent Torino, about your stage trip to Boston, about all of it. For the first time since the warehouse incident, Troy felt genuinely surprised. Where is she now? Protective custody, along with your son. They're safe, but they're also trying to process the fact that you're not the man they thought you were. Troy's jaw clenched. I'm exactly the man I've always been, Agent Morrison. I'm a man who protects his family from threats. If that makes me a monster in your book, then we have very different definitions of morality. What happens now? Morrison asked. Troy considered the question carefully. His family's safety had been his primary concern throughout this entire ordeal, but he'd always known that eliminating Wade might come with consequences beyond federal investigation. Brenna's reaction to learning the truth about his actions was a variable he'd calculated but hoped to avoid. Now, Troy said finally, I go home and have a conversation with my wife about what kind of man she married and what kind of life she wants to live going forward. And if she can't accept what you did, Troy's expression was as cold and unforgiving as winter. Then she'll discover that Wade Hartley wasn't the only person in her life who underestimated Troy Kellerman. Morrison stood up abruptly. Are you threatening your wife, Mr. Kellerman? I'm simply observing that people who betray my trust tend to face consequences for their choices. Troy opened the door and paused. Ask Vincent Torino what happened to the last person who thought they could play games with my family and walk away unscathed. Troy left the federal building knowing that Morrison would investigate that threat and discover that there was no record of anyone else meeting an unfortunate end after crossing Troy Kellerman. But the seed of doubt was planted, and sometimes doubt was more effective than certainty. Because the truth was that Troy had never killed anyone before Wade Hartley. But he discovered that he was very, very good at it. And if his wife couldn't accept the man she'd married, she would learn just how good at it he really was. Chapter 8, The Judgment. Troy found Brenna and Cooper at her mother's house in West Hartford, a modest colonial that had always felt like a sanctuary from the complications of adult life. But as he stood on the familiar front porch, Troy realized that there would be no sanctuary from what was coming next. Eleanor Hoffman answered the door, her face a mask of carefully controlled hostility. Troy's mother-in-law had never particularly liked him. Too intense, too secretive about his work, too much like the soldiers she'd grown up around during her father's military career. But now her dislike had crystallized into something harder and more dangerous. She doesn't want to see you, Eleanor said without preamble. That's not her decision to make. Troy's voice was calm, but there was an undertone that made Eleanor step back involuntarily. She's my wife. Cooper is my son. We're going to have a conversation. Troy, please, Eleanor said, her voice pleading now. Just leave them alone. Haven't you done enough damage? Troy studied his mother-in-law's face, noting the fear in her eyes. Morrison had been thorough in briefing Brenna about the federal investigation's findings. The family knew exactly what Troy was capable of, and they were afraid of him. Good. Fear would make the next conversation more honest. Where are they? Troy asked. Eleanor reluctantly led him through the house to the backyard, where Brenna sat on a wooden swing set that Cooper had outgrown years ago. Their son was nowhere to be seen, probably upstairs in his grandmother's guest room, trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly become much more complicated. Brenna looked up as Troy approached, and he saw something in her expression that he'd never seen before. Not just fear, but a kind of revulsion that cut deeper than any federal interrogation could have managed. "Hello, Brenna." She didn't respond, just stared at him with those green eyes that had once looked at him with love and now reflected nothing but horror. Troy sat down on the swing next to hers, the chains creaking under his weight. "We need to talk." "About what?" Brenna's voice was barely above a whisper. "About how you murdered Wade in cold blood. About how you've been planning it for days. About how you lied to federal agents and manipulated everyone around you to cover up what you did. About how I eliminated a threat to our family." Brenna laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. A threat? Troy, Wade was in federal custody. The DEA was going to arrest him as soon as they finished their investigation. He was going to prison for years. You didn't need to kill him. Troy turned to face her fully, his expression serious. Wade Hartley kidnapped an innocent elderly woman and threatened to blow up half the East Side. He was obsessed with you to the point of psychosis. Even if he'd gone to prison, he would have gotten out eventually. And when he did, he would have come for you and Cooper again. So you appointed yourself judge and executioner. I appointed myself protector of my family, which is what I've always been, Brenna. The only difference is that now you know what that sometimes requires. Brenna stood up abruptly, pacing away from the swing set. "I don't know who you are. I thought I married a good man, a protector, someone who would keep Cooper and me safe. But not like this. Not by becoming a killer." Troy remained seated, watching his wife struggle with the reality of who he'd always been. "I've been a killer since I was 22 years old, Brenna. The Army taught me how to eliminate threats efficiently and without remorse. My business exists because there are people in this world who understand that sometimes violence is the only solution to certain problems. That's different. That was war. That was exactly the same." Troy's voice hardened. "The only difference is the uniform and the flag. Wade Hartley declared war on our family the moment he decided to stalk you and involve our son in his obsession. I ended that war the way wars are always ended, by destroying the enemy's ability to continue fighting." Brenna stopped pacing and turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Cooper saw the news reports, Troy. He knows that Wade is dead. He's asking questions about what happened, and I don't know what to tell him. Tell him the truth. Tell him that his father protected him from a bad man who wanted to hurt our family. How do I explain that his father is a murderer?" Troy stood up slowly, his movement deliberate and controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who had made life and death decisions in situations where hesitation meant death. "You don't get to judge me, Brenna. You don't get to take the moral high ground after you brought this threat into our lives in the first place. Wade Hartley found our family because you opened the door for him. You gave him access to our home, our routine, our son. You created this situation with your affair, and I cleaned up the mess." Brenna's face flushed with anger. "I made a mistake. I had an affair, and I ended it when I realized what I was doing. But that doesn't justify murder. Your mistake almost got Cooper killed," Troy said, his voice rising for the first time. "Your mistake put an innocent elderly woman in the hospital with trauma that she'll never fully recover from. Your mistake brought a drug dealer and would-be kidnapper into our neighborhood. So don't you dare stand there and lecture me about proportional response." They stared at each other across the yard. 13 years of marriage reduced to this moment of absolute judgment. Troy could see Brenna making her decision, weighing her fear of him against her love for their son and her own moral compass. "I want a divorce," she said finally. Troy nodded slowly. "I thought you might. And I want full custody of Cooper. I don't want him around you anymore. I don't want him to think that what you did was acceptable." Now Troy's expression shifted, becoming something cold and predatory that made Brenna take an involuntary step backward. "That's not going to happen," he said quietly. "Troy, you can't." "I can't what?" I can't protect my son from a mother who has such poor judgment that she nearly got him killed. I can't ensure that Cooper grows up understanding that sometimes good men have to do terrible things to protect the people they love. Troy moved closer, and Brenna backed against the house. You seem to be confused about how this is going to work, Brenna. I'll call the police. I'll tell them you're threatening me. Troy's smile was cold as death. And tell them what? That your husband eliminated a threat to your family, and now you're having second thoughts about being married to someone competent enough to keep you safe. He shook his head. Agent Morrison would love to hear that conversation. Brenna's voice was shaking now. What do you want? I want my family back. I want my wife to understand that everything I did was to protect her and our son. And I want Cooper to grow up with a father who will teach him how to be strong enough to handle whatever threatens the people he loves. And if I can't accept that, Troy considered the question with the same methodical approach he'd used to plan Wade's elimination. Brenna was the mother of his child, but she was also a security risk now. She knew too much about his capabilities and his willingness to use them. If she couldn't be trusted to keep the family's secrets, she would have to be managed like any other threat. Then you'll discover that Wade Hartley wasn't the first person to underestimate what I'm willing to do to protect what's mine, Troy said finally. And unlike Wade, you won't get a warning. The threat hung in the air between them, explicit and unmistakable. Brenna understood that her choices had been reduced to two options: accept her husband for what he was, or face the consequences of betraying him. I need time to think, she whispered. Troy nodded. You have until tomorrow morning. But Brenna? He paused at the gate. Cooper comes home with me tonight. Because whatever you decide about our marriage, he's my son, and I protect what's mine. Troy walked back through the house, past Eleanor's terrified face, and climbed the stairs to the guest room where Cooper was hiding. His son looked up from a comic book, his young face still bearing traces of the trauma from recent events. Hey, buddy, Troy said gently. Ready to come home? Cooper nodded and began packing his few belongings. As they prepared to leave, the boy looked up at his father with the kind of direct honesty that only children possessed. Daddy, did you kill the bad man? Troy knelt down to Cooper's eye level, looking into eyes that were so much like his own. Yes, son, I did. Good, Cooper said simply. He was going to hurt Mom and Mrs. Chun. Troy felt something warm and fierce bloom in his chest. His son understood what Brenna couldn't, that some threats could only be ended with finality. As they drove home together, Troy realized that whatever Brenna decided, he'd already won the most important battle. Cooper would grow up knowing that his father was someone who could be counted on to eliminate any threat to their family. And that lesson would serve the boy well in the years to come. Chapter 9. The New Order. 6 months later, Troy stood in the kitchen of his Millbrook Heights home, watching Cooper practice soccer in the backyard. The boy had grown taller over the summer, his movements more confident and assured. The trauma of Wade Hartley's obsession had faded, replaced by the quiet security that came from knowing his father was someone who could handle any threat. Brenna had made her choice, as Troy had known she would. She'd returned home the morning after their conversation at her mother's house, pale and shaken, but resolute. The divorce papers had never been filed. Cooper had never spent another night away from home, and Brenna had never again questioned Troy's methods or judgment. The marriage had changed, of course. The easy intimacy they'd once shared was gone, replaced by something more formal and careful. Brenna no longer looked at Troy with love, but she looked at him with respect and a healthy dose of fear. She understood now that her husband was not a man to be trifled with, betrayed, or underestimated. And that understanding had made their home more peaceful than it had been in years. The doorbell rang, and Troy walked through the house to answer it. Agent Morrison stood on the porch, holding a thick manila envelope, and wearing the expression of a man who'd come to deliver unpleasant news. Agent Morrison, Troy said, opening the door wider. This is unexpected. Mr. Kellerman, I have some news about the Wade Hartley investigation. Troy gestured Morrison into the living room, noting how the federal agent's eyes swept the space with professional interest. The family photos on the mantelpiece had been rearranged. Images of Brenna's affair had been carefully edited from their domestic narrative, leaving only pictures that showed the Kellerman family as a united front. Coffee. Troy asked. No, thank you. This won't take long. Morrison settled into the same chair Wade had occupied during their final conversation. The DEA has officially closed the Wade Hartley case. Self-defense during the protection of a hostage. No charges will be filed. Troy's expression didn't change, but he felt a quiet satisfaction. Morrison had spent months trying to build a case for premeditated murder, but the evidence had never been strong enough to overcome the basic facts. Wade had been an armed kidnapper threatening innocent lives, and Troy had eliminated that threat during a dynamic tactical situation. I appreciate you coming by to let me know personally, Troy said. Morrison opened the manila envelope and pulled out several photographs, surveillance shots showing Troy at various locations around the city over the past 6 months. These are interesting, don't you think? Troy studied the images with professional interest. Morrison's people had been watching him closely, documenting his meetings with clients, his visits to the gun range, his occasional dinners with Vincent Torino. All perfectly legal activities, but the message was clear. The federal government was keeping tabs on Troy Kellerman. Interesting how? Troy asked. 3 of your business clients have reported workplace accidents involving employees who'd been skimming money or threatening to report safety violations to federal regulators. A man who'd been harassing one of your female clients had his car run off the road during an apparent mechanical failure. A drug dealer who'd been operating near Cooper's elementary school overdosed on his own product. Morrison gathered up the photos. Statistically, it's remarkable how many problems seem to resolve themselves around people who've hired your security consulting services. Troy's smile was thin and cold. I provide very thorough security assessments, Agent Morrison. When clients understand the full scope of threats they're facing, they're able to make informed decisions about how to protect themselves. And if those decisions happen to result in the elimination of threats through convenient accidents, I'm not responsible for the choices my clients make after receiving my professional recommendations. Morrison stood up, his frustration evident. You're running a murder-for-hire operation disguised as a security consulting business. I'm running a legitimate business that helps people identify and address security vulnerabilities. Troy's voice remained level and professional. If you have evidence of criminal activity, Agent Morrison, I suggest you file charges. Otherwise, these fishing expeditions are starting to feel like harassment. Morrison walked toward the door, but paused in the hallway. What happened to Wade Hartley changed you, didn't it? You discovered that you enjoyed killing. Troy considered the question honestly. Wade's death had been necessary, but Morrison was right about one thing. Troy had discovered something about himself during that warehouse confrontation. He'd learned that he was exceptionally good at eliminating threats, and that knowledge had opened up new possibilities for his business. What happened to Wade Hartley taught me that some problems require permanent solutions, Troy said finally, and that there are people in this world who are willing to pay for those solutions. And your family? How do they feel about what you've become? Troy glanced toward the kitchen window, where he could see Brenna preparing dinner while keeping one eye on Cooper's soccer practice. His wife moved through her domestic routine with quiet efficiency, no longer the carefree woman he'd married, but someone more careful and aware of the complexities of the world they lived in. My family understands that their safety and security are my primary concerns, Troy said. They understand that I'm someone who can be counted on to handle any threat that emerges. And they understand that loyalty and discretion are rewarded, while betrayal and carelessness have consequences. Morrison shook his head. You've turned your own family into hostages. I've turned my family into people who understand how the world actually works. Troy opened the front door, his message clear that the conversation was over. Good day, Agent Morrison. After Morrison left, Troy returned to the kitchen where Brenna was cutting vegetables for a salad. She looked up as he entered, her expression carefully neutral. What did he want? She asked. To let us know that the Wade Hartley investigation is officially closed. Brenna nodded and returned to her food preparation. Over the past 6 months, she'd learned not to ask too many questions about Troy's business or the various news reports about accidents and overdoses that seemed to cluster around his clients. She'd learned that ignorance was safer than knowledge, and that her husband's protection came with a price that was easier to pay if she didn't examine it too closely. Cooper wants to know if he can have a friend over for dinner this weekend, Brenna said, changing the subject to safer ground. Which friend? Tyler Morrison. His father works for the government. Troy's smile was genuinely amused. Agent Morrison's son? That's interesting. Should I tell Cooper no? Troy considered the request carefully. Having Morrison's child in his home would be an interesting psychological pressure on the federal agent. It would also give Troy an opportunity to observe the Morrison family dynamics and potentially gather intelligence about ongoing federal investigations. Tell Cooper yes, Troy said finally. I think it would be good for him to have friends whose fathers understand the importance of protecting their families. That evening, after Cooper had gone to bed and Brenna had retired to their bedroom, Troy sat in his home office reviewing files for new clients. His business had grown significantly since the Wade Hartley incident, as word spread through certain circles about the thoroughness of his security assessments and the finality of his problem-solving methods. The phone rang, and Troy recognized the number as belonging to a prominent Hartford businessman whose wife had been receiving threatening letters from a former employee. Mr. Kellerman? This is Richard Shun. I believe you know my Aunt Helen. Troy leaned back in his chair, remembering the elderly woman Wade had kidnapped. Hello, Mr. Chun. How is Mrs. Chun doing? Better, thanks to you. She speaks very highly of how you handled that situation. Richard's voice carried the kind of careful respect that came from understanding exactly what Troy was capable of. I have a problem that might benefit from your particular expertise. What kind of problem? The kind that requires a permanent solution. Troy pulled out a legal pad and began taking notes. Outside his office window, the neighborhood was quiet and peaceful, full of families who slept safely because men like Troy Kellerman were willing to do what was necessary to maintain order in an increasingly chaotic world. Tell me about it, Troy said, and began planning another solution to another problem. Because that's what he did now. That's what he'd always done, really, but now he did it for profit instead of patriotism. And business was very, very good. In the end, Wade Hartley had given Troy something valuable. The knowledge that he was exceptionally skilled at eliminating threats, and that there were people willing to pay handsomely for those skills. Troy Kellerman had found his true calling, and anyone who threatened what was his would learn, as Wade had learned, that some lessons were permanent. The neighborhood remained peaceful. The family remained protected. And Troy remained exactly what he'd always been, a man who finished what others started, forever and always. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end,